The moment Mabel Gentry stepped off the stagecoach in Dusty Creek, Kansas, in the blazing summer of 1878, every bag she owned tumbled off the roof rack and landed in the dirt like a declaration of everything that had gone wrong in her life up until that very second. She stood there, 24 years old, cheeks flushed from the heat and from the humiliation, watching her trunk, her leather satchel, her hat box, and the small carpet bag her mother had stitched together from old curtain fabric all pile into the dust of a town she had never set foot in before. The stagecoach driver muttered something that was not quite an apology and climbed back up to his bench without offering so much as a glance her way. The other passengers brushed past her, adjusting their hats, patting the dust from their coats, moving on about their lives as though a woman's entire world was not sitting in the middle of a dirt road on a Tuesday afternoon. Mabel pressed her lips together. She was not going to cry. She had made herself that promise on the long and jarring ride from St. Louis, where she had sold the modest house her late father left her, packed her entire existence into those 4 bags, and bought a one-way ticket to Dusty Creek, because her cousin Clara had written in a letter that there was a schoolteacher position open, and that the air out west was clean and the people were decent, and that a woman could start fresh if she had the nerve for it. Mabel had the nerve. She had always had the nerve. She just did not, at this particular moment, have the strength to lift a leather trunk, a hat box, a carpet bag, and a satchel all at once while wearing a dress that had been humid and clinging to her for the better part of 3 days. She crouched down and grabbed the satchel first, then tried to wedge the carpet bag under her arm while reaching for the hat box, and the whole arrangement immediately began to tip sideways in a way that was going to end in further catastrophe. That was when she felt the weight leave her hands, not grabbed, not snatched, not even accompanied by a word. Someone simply reached down beside her and lifted the trunk, tucked the hat box under one arm, and stood up in one smooth and unhurried motion. The way a man moves when carrying things is as natural to him as breathing. Mabel straightened and turned. He was tall. Not dramatically so, but tall enough that she had to tip her chin up to look at his face properly, which she did because she was the kind of woman who looked people in the face when she wanted to understand them. He had dark brown hair that curled slightly at the collar of a worn canvas work shirt, a jaw that had seen a razor sometime in the last 2 days but not today, and eyes so dark a shade of brown they were nearly black, and he was looking not at her but at the bags he had just picked up as though he was calculating their weight distribution. He had not asked. He had not announced himself. He had simply seen something that needed doing and done it. "Where are you headed?" he said, and his voice was low and even the kind of voice that does not need to raise itself to be heard. Mabel blinked. "The boarding house," she said. "I was told it is on the main road, a white building with blue shutters." "2 streets over," he said. "I know it." He started walking. Not in a rush, not performatively. Just walking, carrying her trunk and her hat box as though the afternoon had simply arranged itself to include this task. Mabel grabbed her satchel and her carpet bag and fell into step beside him because there was nothing else logical to do, and also because she was genuinely uncertain what would happen if she did not. The town of Dusty Creek spread out around them in that particular way of frontier towns in 1878, raw-edged and earnest, all unpainted timber and hand-lettered signs, and the smell of sawdust and horse and iron. A blacksmith rang away at something on the far corner. A woman in a calico apron swept her porch with the focused determination of someone who has been sweeping the same dust for years. A boy chased a dog across the road, and both of them disappeared between 2 buildings. It was loud and quiet in equal measure, the way places are when they are still deciding what they want to become. Mabel watched the town and the man beside her in the same glance, which she was self-aware enough to recognize was a strange thing to do. "I am Mabel Gentry," she said, because it seemed rude not to introduce herself to someone who was carrying her belongings. "John Underwood," he said. He did not offer anything else, and she did not press. They walked the 2 streets in a comfortable silence that surprised her because silence with strangers was rarely comfortable in her experience. The boarding house was exactly as described, white with blue shutters, though the white was more of a weathered cream, and the blue had faded to something closer to the color of a winter sky. A woman with red hair twisted up under a cotton cap appeared in the doorway before they even reached the porch steps. "You must be Miss Gentry," she said. Clara Whitmore rode ahead. "I am Ruth Ansley. Welcome to Dusty Creek." "Thank you, Mrs. Ansley," Mabel said. John Underwood set the trunk and hat box down on the porch with the same careful unhurriedness with which he had picked them up. He straightened and turned to go, and Mabel found herself speaking before she had fully decided to. "Mr. Underwood," she said. He stopped and looked at her. In the full afternoon light she could see more clearly the particular quality of his face, not handsome in a polished way, but the kind of face that had been tested by weather and work and something else she could not name, and had come through it looking like it knew what it was. "Thank you," she said. "You did not have to do that." "I know," he said, and there was nothing dismissive or dismissing in it. It was simply a fact, stated plainly by someone who had no interest in being thanked for a thing he had considered its own sufficient reason. He touched the brim of his hat, a gesture so old and worn in it looked like muscle memory, and he walked back the way they had come, and Mabel stood on the porch of her new boarding house in her new town watching him go, and feeling something she could not immediately identify settle into her chest like a stone dropping into still water. She did not know, standing there with her cheeks still flushed, and her dress still dusty and her heart still raw from everything she had left behind in St. Louis, that she had just lost herself entirely. She would not understand that for some weeks. But it had happened in that moment beside the stagecoach, with the bags, with the silence, with those unhurried dark eyes that looked at the weight of her things and simply decided to carry it. That was the moment. She just did not know it yet. Ruth Ansley was a cheerful and practical woman who had been running the boarding house since her husband passed 3 years prior, and she had opinions about most things and shared them freely, which Mabel found immediately endearing. Over a supper of salt pork and boiled potatoes, and the best cornbread Mabel had tasted in her life, Ruth told her everything she needed to know about Dusty Creek in the time it took to eat. The schoolhouse was on the east edge of town, freshly built the previous autumn by a committee of ranching families who had decided their children needed more than Sunday sermons and the occasional almanac. The previous teacher had been a young man from Ohio who had lasted 6 months before concluding that Kansas in winter was not compatible with his constitution, and leaving on the January stage. The town had been seeking a replacement since February, and Mabel's arrival in late June was regarded as something of a rescue. "You will have 19 students," Ruth said, spooning more potatoes onto Mabel's plate without asking. "Ages range from 6 to 14. The older boys can be difficult, particularly the Reeves boys, and there are 3 of them, but you look like a woman who does not intimidate easily." "I was raised by a schoolteacher," Mabel said. "My father taught for 30 years. He had opinions about the Reeves types of boys." "Good opinions. Very practical ones," Mabel said. Ruth smiled and poured them both more coffee. "You will do fine." Then, because Ruth was a woman who observed things and did not always restrain herself from commenting on them, she said, "I noticed it was John Underwood who brought your things up." "He picked up my bags off the road," Mabel said carefully. "I did not have enough hands." "He does not do that for everyone," Ruth said, not looking at Mabel, focusing on the coffee. "I imagine he picks up bags for people who need them picked up," Mabel said. Ruth looked at her then with a small smile that communicated considerably more than words. "His ranch is about 4 miles northeast of town. He comes in on Tuesdays for supplies and Saturdays for the post. He has been here 2 years, built the spread himself with 1 hired hand and a mule, keeps to himself, does his work. Very well regarded." Mabel absorbed this information and said nothing, and Ruth, having made her point, changed the subject to the question of which of the 2 church services Mabel preferred to attend. She lay in her new bed that night, narrow and clean, with a patchwork quilt that smelled of cedar and lavender, and stared at the ceiling in the dark and told herself she had come to Dusty Creek to teach school and to build a life with her own hands, not to think about a man with dark eyes who had picked up her bags without being asked and walked her to her door without making anything of it. She told herself this with great conviction. The ceiling offered no response, and the stone in her chest did not move. The schoolhouse was everything she had hoped it would be, and everything she had feared it would be simultaneously. The building was solid, newly built timber with 4 real glass windows, a proper blackboard, and 24 desks in varying states of structural integrity. The children were wild and curious and loud and wonderful, and the 3 Reeves boys, Thomas, who was 14, Mitchell, who was 12, and little Aaron, who was 8 and appeared to be entirely constructed from mischief, were exactly as advertised. But Mabel was her father's daughter, and she had learned from a man who believed that education was not something done to children but something grown inside them if you planted the right seeds. She did not shout. She did not threaten. She asked questions and she listened to answers, and she brought a copy of Treasure Island which she read aloud every Friday afternoon as a reward for the week's work. And by the end of the 2nd week, Thomas Reeves was asking if they could have Friday reading on Thursdays too. Dusty Creek took to Mabel Gentry the way small frontier towns take to people who clearly intend to stay, cautiously at first, and then with the particular warmth of a community that has been let down before and is not yet certain they will not be again, and then, once convinced, with a thoroughness that borders on ownership. She was invited to the Hendersons for Sunday dinner after her 2nd week. She was asked to join the church sewing circle, which she did despite being only a mediocre seamstress, because the conversation was excellent. The postmaster, an elderly man named Garvey with a spectacular white mustache, took to saving her letters at the front of the stack so she never had to wait. The woman at the dry goods store, whose name was Patricia Flood, offered her a credit account after a month, which was a trust not extended to newcomers lightly. It was 4 Tuesdays after her arrival when she saw John Underwood again. She was crossing the main road with a stack of primers she had ordered from the bookseller in Wichita, which had arrived that morning, and which she was carrying back to the schoolhouse because she could not wait until afternoon to organize them. And she was not watching where she was going with any particular attention, because she was reading the invoice tucked between 2 of the books. She did not run into him. She very nearly ran into his horse, a large gray animal that stopped with extraordinary patience about 2 feet from where Mabel stumbled to a halt, and the sound of the horse stopping was what made her look up. John Underwood was sitting in the saddle looking down at her with an expression that was not alarm or irritation but something that might have been the very beginning of amusement, so slight it could have been mistaken for nothing. "Miss Gentry," he said. "Mr. Underwood," she said. She looked at the horse. "I apologize to you and your horse both. Pepper has been startled by worse," he said. He looked at the stack of books in her arms. "That is a considerable load." "I am managing," she said, which was technically true, although 3 of the primers were beginning to slide. He dismounted without ceremony and caught the 3 sliding primers before they completed their journey to the ground, and added them to the stack he then lifted out of her arms entirely, and she let him do it because the alternative was watching everything land in the dirt again, and also because there was something about the way John Underwood moved through the world that made arguing with him feel like arguing with the tide. "Where are you going?" he said. "The schoolhouse," she said. "East Road." He looped Pepper's reins around his wrist and they walked, the horse ambling contentedly behind them, and Mabel fell into step beside him and felt the same peculiar ease as the first time, that silence that asked nothing of her. "How is the school going?" he said after a moment. "Very well," she said. "We finished long division this week and nobody wept, which I am counting as a triumph." The corner of his mouth moved. Definitely the beginning of amusement. "Thomas Reeves." "He is the best student I have when he decides to be," Mabel said, "which is about 3 days out of 5. I am working on the other two. His father is a hard man, John said matter-of-factly. I know, Mabel said. She had heard enough from Ruth and from the sewing circle to understand the Reeves household, and she had adjusted her approach to Thomas accordingly, making sure she never made him feel small in front of the others. But Thomas is not his father. John Underwood looked at her then, a quick sideways glance, and she caught it and held it for a half-second, and then they both looked forward again at the road. No, he said. He does not have to be. They reached the schoolhouse, and he carried the books inside and set them on her desk, and she thanked him, and he said it was nothing, and she said it was not nothing, and he looked at her the way people look when they are recalculating something and have not yet finished the arithmetic. I will see you around town, Miss Gentry, he said. I imagine you will, she said. He left, and she stood in the middle of the schoolhouse with afternoon light falling through the 4 glass windows and 14 primers stacked neatly on her desk, and that stone in her chest absolutely immovable. And she finally acknowledged to herself, quietly and without drama, that she was in a great deal of trouble. She began to notice him in the particular way you notice things once you have decided to, which is to say, she noticed him everywhere. On Tuesdays at Flood's dry goods store, loading supplies with a quiet efficiency. On Saturdays at the post office, reading a letter leaning against the wall outside with his hat pushed back on his head. At the church social in July, standing near the fence with a plate of food he was eating without sitting down, talking to the blacksmith, a man named Harold Briggs, with the easy conversation of two people who understand each other without requiring much of each other. She did not engineer situations. She was not the kind of woman who did that. But Dusty Creek was a small town, and a woman who is paying attention to a man in a small town will find that the geography arranges itself cooperatively. They spoke 3 more times in July. Once at the post office, where they reached for the door at the same moment and both stepped back, and she laughed, genuinely laughed, and he looked startled by the sound of it before his expression settled into something warm. Once at the general store, when she could not reach the top shelf and he was simply there, handing her down the tin of baking powder she needed without being asked, which was, she was beginning to understand, simply the way he operated in the world. And once at the church social, where Harold Briggs introduced them formally as though they had not already met 3 times, and John Underwood shook her hand with the kind of handshake that does not perform itself, and said it was a pleasure to meet her properly, and she said the same, and Harold Briggs looked between them with the expression of a man watching something he considers already settled. It was Ruth who finally said the thing plainly, because Ruth was constitutionally incapable of leaving plainness on the table. They were sitting on the boarding house porch in the early evening of a late July day, the air finally cooling to something bearable, and Ruth was mending a shirt and Mabel was writing letters, and the fireflies were just beginning to suggest themselves at the edge of the yard. John Underwood asked me at church this morning whether you were settling in well, Ruth said. Mabel kept writing. That is a kind thing to ask. He asked Harold Briggs the same thing 2 weeks ago, Ruth said. Mabel set down her pen. Ruth, I am just telling you what is observable, Ruth said serenely. He is being neighborly, Mabel said. He has lived here 2 years, Ruth said, and in that time he has never once asked me whether anyone was settling in well. Mabel picked up her pen again. The fireflies multiplied at the edge of the yard. She wrote 3 words of her letter and stopped. He is a good man, she said, not quite a question, a way of thinking out loud. The best I have encountered in this town, Ruth said, simply and without embellishment, which was unusual for Ruth, and therefore more convincing than any elaborate endorsement. Mabel finished her letter. The fireflies took over the yard entirely. And she let herself, privately and carefully, consider the idea that the stone in her chest was not going anywhere because it did not want to go anywhere. The invitation came in the first week of August, which was perhaps the hottest month Kansas had to offer, the kind of heat that sits on your shoulders like something with weight. John Underwood appeared at the schoolhouse on a Friday afternoon as she was erasing the blackboard, which she had not been expecting, and she turned around from the board with chalk dust on her hands and her hair escaping its pins in the heat, and saw him standing in the doorway with his hat in his hands. "Miss Gentry," he said. "Mr. Underwood," she said. "Come in out of the sun." He came in and stood in a way that was at odds with itself, a big capable man made briefly uncertain by being somewhere he was not sure was his territory. She thought it was one of the most human things she had ever seen. "I wanted to ask," he said, "if you might want to see the ranch. I know that is an unusual invitation and I would ask properly." He paused. "If you were interested, if you would be comfortable with Ruth as a chaperone. I thought Sunday afternoon. I have some improvements done since spring that He stopped. "I am proud of them," he said, which seemed to cost him something small to admit, and she liked him enormously for admitting it. Mabel set the eraser down. "I would like that very much," she said. Something in his face settled, the way a house settles when the foundation is good. "Sunday afternoon, then," he said. "I will bring the wagon." He came Sunday with a clean wagon and a cleaner shirt and Pepper hitched alongside a second horse, a dark roan who Ruth immediately christened Handsome in a murmur that only Mabel heard. The three of them rode out along the northeast road with Ruth sitting in the back of the wagon, telling them both about a letter she had received from her sister in Cincinnati, which covered the 4 miles to John's ranch in excellent time. The ranch was not large. It was not meant to be large yet. But it was solid and it was carefully made, and Mabel could see in every post and every beam and every stone of the chimney the particular attention of a man who was building something he intended to last. The house was 1 story with a covered porch that faced west for the evening light, 2 rooms finished and a 3rd framed out, and a barn that was newer than the house and considerably more spacious. "You built this yourself?" Mabel said, standing on the porch, looking out at the land that rolled away in every direction in shades of summer gold. "Myself and a man named Carlyle who worked for me the first season," John said. He was standing beside her, not close, but in the way that makes the space between 2 people feel like something rather than nothing. "He moved on to Colorado in the spring. It is just me now." "You manage the cattle alone." "I have 15 head," he said. "It is manageable. I want to expand in the spring, hire on a permanent hand." He paused. "The land is good. The grass is good. It takes time." "Things that are built to last usually do," she said. He looked at her then with those dark eyes, and she looked back, and the silence was not empty. It was full of something neither of them had put into words yet, but they were both aware of it, standing on that west-facing porch in the August heat with Ruth Ansley tactfully examining a particularly interesting fence post 20 yards away. "I wanted you to see it," he said quietly. "I am not sure why exactly. I just wanted you to see it." "I am glad I did," she said. They had coffee on the porch, and Ruth came back from examining the fence post and talked about her sister some more, and John listened with genuine attention the way he did everything. And by the time they drove back to town, the sun was going down in the particular spectacular manner that Kansas has, painting the whole western sky in shades that no painter would attempt because no one would believe them. Mabel sat beside John on the wagon bench and Ruth dozed lightly in the back, and the horses walked at a comfortable pace and the air cooled as the sun fell, and Mabel thought, with a clarity that surprised her for its simplicity, "I am happy. Right now, exactly here I am happy." She had not felt that cleanly in a long time. He walked her to the door of the boarding house when they arrived, Ruth having slipped inside ahead of them with a yawn that was only partially theatrical, and they stood on the porch in the last of the evening light, and John Underwood turned his hat in his hands twice, the same nervous motion she had seen in the schoolhouse. "Miss Gentry," he said. "Yes," she said, and then immediately recognized that she had answered before he had asked anything, and felt the heat rise in her face. He noticed, and the amusement she had glimpsed before was present now in full, warm, and not unkind. "I was going to ask if you might want to do this again," he said. "There is a dance at the Hendersons in 2 weeks. "If you would go with me." "I would go with you," she said. She did not see any reason to make him wait when her answer was perfectly clear to her. "All right," he said, and smiled, a real one, not the near miss of amusement but the full thing, transforming his face entirely, and she thought wildly that she should have been warned about that smile because she had not been prepared for it. "Good night, Mr. Underwood," she said. "Good night, Miss Gentry," he said, and settled his hat on his head and walked to the wagon with a lightness in his step that had not been there when he arrived. Mabel went inside, and Ruth was absolutely not asleep, sitting in the kitchen with coffee as though she had simply been there all along, and Mabel sat down across from her, and Ruth looked at her over the rim of her cup and said nothing, which was the loudest nothing Mabel had ever heard. "He asked me to the Henderson dance," Mabel said. Ruth lifted her cup in something that was half toast, half salute. The 2 weeks between the invitation and the Henderson dance were the longest 2 weeks in Mabel Gentry's adult life, which she acknowledged was absurd and did not stop being true. She threw herself into school with doubled energy, organized a spelling competition that so consumed Thomas Reeves that he stopped his habit of staring out the window entirely, and read further ahead in Treasure Island than the class had gotten to, which meant she already knew how things turned out and had to perform ignorance on Fridays, which her father would have called poetic justice. She saw John twice during those 2 weeks, both incidental meetings, once at the dry goods store and once on the road outside the post office, and both times they were polite and warm and said very little because very little needed saying, which she had come to understand was one of his particular qualities. He did not fill silence with noise just because the silence was there. She borrowed a dress from Clara Whitmore for the dance because Clara was her height and had better party dresses, and Clara helped her pin her hair up with a tortoiseshell comb that had been their grandmother's, and Clara spent the entire process asking questions with the shameless curiosity of someone who considers herself personally involved in the outcome of other people's romantic situations. "Is he handsome?" Clara said. "He is not unhandsome," Mabel said carefully. "That is not what I asked," Clara said. "He is very handsome," Mabel said. "Are you satisfied?" "Deeply," Clara said, and pinned the comb in at a particularly flattering angle. The Henderson barn had been cleared and lantern-lit, and someone had brought a fiddle and a guitar, and the particular energy that frontier dances generate, joyful and vital and a little desperate with it, the way people celebrate when they know that life out here can be hard, and so the joy must be seized when it arrives. Half the town was there. Children chased each other around the perimeter of adults. Old Garvey from the post office was dancing with a woman who could have been his wife or his sister or both. The 3 Reeves boys were in the corner eating everything the refreshment table offered, and Thomas Reeves caught Mabel's eye and gave her a nod of acknowledgement that she returned gravely, as between equals. John Underwood found her 5 minutes after she arrived, appearing out of the crowd with a quiet assurance that she had come to recognize as simply his manner. "You look very fine," he said. "Thank you," she said. "So do you." He was wearing a clean dark coat over a white shirt, and he had shaved, and his hair was newly cut, and he looked. She found it difficult to look at him for very long without becoming slightly unmoored, which was a new and interesting experience. They danced. He was not a polished dancer, but he was steady, which mattered more, and she was better than he was, and she led subtly enough that he did not notice, and then noticed and was amused rather than bothered by it, which told her a great deal about him. "You are steering," he said on the second song. "I am assisting," she said. "Those are different words for the same thing," he said. "Not in all cases," she said. He laughed, and it was the first time she had heard him properly laugh low and genuine, and unreserved in a way that was almost startling coming from someone so habitually self-contained, and something in her chest that had been carefully positioned as a stone rearranged itself into something warmer and less stable. They danced twice more and talked between sets, standing near the open barn doors where the night air came in carrying the smell of grass and distant rain. He told her about Kansas, about the particular beauty of it in autumn when the grasslands turned, about the first winter he had spent on his land alone in the half-built house, about why he had left Ohio 3 years ago without going into too much detail about the particulars. And she told him about St. Louis, about her father and the schoolroom, and the strange grief of selling a house that had been a home, about why she had chosen to come west when she could have stayed and found a teaching position closer to everything familiar. "Why did you," he said, "come west?" She thought about it honestly. "'Cause familiar was comfortable and comfort was starting to feel like a kind of stopping," she said. "I did not want to stop, not yet." He looked at her for a moment. "No," he said, "I understand that." It began to rain on the ride home. Not a storm, just a gentle August rain, warm as bathwater, the kind that makes the air smell like the earth coming back to itself. Ruth, who was with them again in the wagon, tilted her face up to it with a look of pure pleasure. Mabel did the same. Beside her on the bench, John Underwood watched them both with an expression she was learning to recognize. The quiet pleasure of a man who is looking at something he did not expect and finds it better than anything he planned. He held an umbrella over Mabel when he helped her down from the wagon at the boarding house. He had produced it from somewhere in the wagon bed, which made her think he had been prepared for rain, which made her think he had paid attention to the weather, which she found unreasonably moving. "I had a very good evening," she told him on the porch, with Ruth already inside and the rain coming down soft around the porch roof. "I did too," he said. He hesitated and she let him because he was a man who thought before he spoke, and that was worth waiting for. "I would like to court you properly, Miss Gentry," he said, "if that is acceptable to you." She had known this was coming. She had been thinking about nothing else all evening, really, underneath the dancing and the talking and the rain. She had thought about it clearly and completely and arrived at the same place every time. "It is acceptable to me," she said. "Very much so." The rain came down soft around the porch, and he looked at her with those dark eyes that she had been thinking about since the first afternoon on the road when he had picked up her bags without being asked. And something in his face was entirely unguarded for just a moment, the way a room looks when someone opens all the windows at once. "Good," he said. "Good." He said good night, and she went inside, and Ruth called from the kitchen, "How did it go?" And Mabel leaned against the closed door and said, "Very well," in a voice she could not quite control, and Ruth said, "Ha," with the satisfaction of a woman who considers herself an excellent judge of these things. Courting in Dusty Creek, Kansas, in 1878 was a project undertaken with the respectful awareness that an entire town was watching. Mabel did not mind the watching. She minded the waiting, which was illogical and inconvenient and entirely beyond her management. John came on Sundays. That was the arrangement. He came with the wagon on Sunday afternoons, and they went for a ride, or they sat on the boarding house porch, or once they walked to the edge of town where the schoolhouse stood, and she showed him the garden she had planted behind it, sweet peas and sunflowers, and a row of tomatoes that had no real practical purpose beyond the fact that growing things pleased her. He brought her a book in September, a copy of George Eliot's Middlemarch, which he had ordered from the bookseller in Wichita, which meant he had ordered it before he had even asked her to the dance, which she only worked out later. She sat with that knowledge for a while after he told her quietly that he had thought she might like it. "You ordered this in August," she said. "Early August," he said, with the careful neutrality of someone who has just revealed more than they planned to. "Before the dance," she said. "Before I asked you to the dance," he agreed. He looked at her steadily. "I was fairly certain about the outcome." "Were you?" she said. "I was hopeful," he corrected, and the distinction was careful and genuine, and she thought that was the most honest thing she had heard in a very long time. The autumn came in the way Kansas autumns do, fast and gorgeous and slightly ruthless. The grasslands turned as John had said they would, going golden and amber and rust, and the sky over the prairie took on that particular depth of blue that only happens when the humidity leaves and the air turns crisp, and the world seems to have been freshly varnished. She was in love with Kansas in October in a way she had not expected, the same way she was in love with John Underwood in a way she had not expected and could not now imagine being without. She had not said any of this to him. He had not said it to her. But it was present in everything. In the way he sat close enough on the wagon bench that their shoulders touched on the rough stretches of road. In the way he always knew when her coffee was empty before she did. In the way she had stopped noticing when he picked things up for her, not because he did it less, but because it had become as natural as anything else about him. As native to her understanding of him as his voice or his hands, or the way he looked at the land, with the measuring love of someone who has staked himself to it. They had their first real argument in October over a matter that was, in retrospect, very small, which is to say it was not about the small thing at all, but about something larger that neither of them had found the direct language for yet. It started with the school. There had been a meeting of the school committee, the ranching families who funded the position, and word had reached Mabel through Patricia Flood that one of the committee members, a man named Horace Selman, who owned the largest cattle operation in the county, had expressed the opinion that a schoolteacher position in Dusty Creek was appropriately a temporary position for a woman, by which he meant until she married, at which point the position would naturally be filled by someone else. Mabel had heard this with the particular cold clarity that comes over a person when they encounter an injustice that is so casually stated it clearly does not expect to be challenged. She went to the next committee meeting and said, calmly and without raised voice, that she had no intention of vacating the position for any reason other than choosing to, and that the children of Dusty Creek were being well served, and that she expected her contract to be renewed in the spring, and that she would be glad to discuss the matter further if anyone had a specific professional concern about her work, as distinct from a general concern about the fact of her gender. Horace Selman had not enjoyed this. The rest of the committee, somewhat to Mabel's surprise, had said they had no professional concerns and agreed to the contract renewal, and that had been the end of it in practical terms. When she told John about it on Sunday, she was not entirely sure what she expected. She was still fresh from the meeting and her chin was still up in the way it got when she had been fighting something and was not ready to stop fighting. What she did not expect was for him to say carefully, "It might be wise not to make an enemy of Selman. He has a lot of influence in this county." She looked at him. "Are you suggesting I should have stayed quiet?" "I am suggesting that there are ways of handling things that do not require what?" she said. "Saying directly what is true, standing up for something that is obviously right." "Mabel," he said, and she noticed he had used her name without the miss, which was a thing they had been negotiating toward for weeks and in other circumstances would have pleased her enormously. "I am not saying you were wrong. I am saying that sometimes." "Sometimes what?" she said. "Sometimes a woman should let a man tell her she has no place in her own profession and smile, and say nothing because he is influential." The silence between them was a different kind of silence than usual, with an edge to it. "No," he said after a moment, "that is not what I am saying." He stopped, reconsidered. She watched him do it. "I was worried about you," he said. "That is what I was saying badly." The edge in the silence softened somewhat. "You were worried," she said. "Selman is not a good man to cross unnecessarily," he said. "And my first thought was not whether you were right or wrong. My first thought was whether you were safe." She looked at him for a long moment. The worry in his face was genuine, undisguised, not a performance of concern but the real thing. She understood then that he had not been questioning her courage or her judgment. He had been afraid for her in the particular way of someone who has come to regard another person's safety as something personally at stake for them. She took a breath. "I understand," she said, "and you should understand that I cannot be the kind of person who stays quiet when something is wrong. I am not built that way." "I know," he said. "I knew it before you told me." He looked at her with an expression that was complicated and warm. "I would not have it otherwise. I just reserve the right to worry about you." "That is allowable," she said, "as long as worry does not become interference." "I am not an interfering man," he said, which was absolutely true, and they both knew it. They sat in the new quiet for a moment, and then he refilled her coffee without being asked, and she accepted it without comment, and the particular rough patch smoothed itself out, not with any grand ceremony, but with the simple continuity of two people who have decided that each other is worth the occasional difficulty. Horace Selman, for his part, glared at Mabel in church for 3 Sundays and then appeared to lose interest in the campaign, which she privately found gratifying. November brought the first hard cold, and with it a particular clarity that the plains take on when the sky lowers and the wind means business. John had taken on a new hand in October, a young man of 22 named Sam Pryor, recently arrived from Arkansas, who was quiet and competent and had an excellent way with horses, and the ranch had expanded by 12 head of cattle purchased from a drive passing through, which meant John was building toward something real, and he was doing it with a steadiness that Mabel found herself returning to in her thoughts like a touchstone. He brought her wildflowers in September when they were still available, and after the first frost, he brought her a jar of wild honey one of his neighbors had been selling. And the week before Thanksgiving he appeared at the schoolhouse on a Tuesday afternoon, not his usual day, and stood in the doorway in his coat and hat with his expression composed, and his hands entirely still, which she had come to read as the signal that he was about to say something he had been constructing carefully. She sent the children home early. She was a practical woman. She met him at the door and they walked out to the school garden, which was brown and finished for the season, the sunflowers all gone to seed, the sweet peas long done. The November sky was the color of pewter and the wind came across the grasslands with a purpose. "I want to say something," he said. "All right," she said. "I have not said it before because I wanted to be sure," he said. "And I am sure. I was fairly sure before the summer was out, but I wanted to give it the time it deserved." He paused. "I love you, Mabel." The wind moved through the seed heads of the dead sunflowers. The pewter sky held everything in it. "I love you," she said, and it was the simplest sentence she had ever spoken, which was exactly right because it was the truest thing she had ever said. He took her hand in both of his, and they stood in the dead garden in the November cold, and that was better than any ballroom, better than any grand romantic scene she had ever read about in any novel, because it was real and it was theirs. "I would like to ask you to marry me," he said. "Not today. I want to do it properly, with a ring and with time, so you know it is not said in the heat of the moment." He looked at her steadily. "But I wanted you to know the direction I am going, so you can tell me if it is not the direction you want." "John," she said. "Yes," he said. "It is exactly the direction I want," she said. He raised her hand and pressed his lips to her knuckles briefly and with a gravity that made the gesture feel consecrated, and she thought she might be shaking slightly, although it was difficult to tell with the wind. "Good," he said, for the second time in their knowing of each other, with the same weight he had given the word before, and she thought she would never hear that word spoken by anyone else without feeling this. Christmas in Dusty Creek was a communal affair organized primarily by the church and secondarily by Ruth Ansley, who had strong opinions about the decorating of public spaces and the appropriate quantity of dried fruit in holiday bread. Mabel organized the school children in a performance of readings and songs, and Thomas Reeves memorized a long poem about winter and recited it without once losing his place, which made his mother cry in a completely unexpected and touching way. John came to the performance and sat in the second row and watched her manage 19 children with a look of transparent pride that he made no attempt to conceal, which she noticed from the front of the room, and which made her lose her place briefly in her own organizing notes. On Christmas Eve he came to the boarding house with a small package wrapped in brown paper, and inside it was a ring, a simple band of silver with a small garnet set in it, unpretentious and carefully chosen, clearly made by a jeweler in Wichita given the card tucked inside the paper. "I said I would do it properly," he said. They were on the porch, which had become their porch over the months without either of them formally designating it as such. The night was cold and clear and full of stars, and she could hear Ruth inside at the piano, playing quietly, which Ruth had timed to maximize the scene's atmosphere, and she was not subtle about it. "Mabel Gentry," he said, "will you marry me?" She looked at the ring and she looked at him, and she thought of the stagecoach and the bags in the dirt and those dark eyes that had simply looked at what needed doing and done it, and the months of Sundays and coffee and rain and dancing and wildflowers and arguments, and the November garden and the particular steady way he moved through the world like a man who has made his choices and stands by them. "Yes," she said. "Absolutely yes." He slid the ring onto her finger and she looked at it and looked at him, and then she laughed. The same genuine laugh she had given him on the day they nearly collided in front of the post office. The laugh that had startled him. And it startled him again, and then he was laughing too. Both of them laughing on the porch on Christmas Eve under all those stars. And from inside the house, Ruth's piano playing shifted into something that sounded suspiciously celebratory. They were married in the first week of April, 1879, when the Kansas spring was putting on its best argument for its own existence, the prairie going green and the wildflowers coming up between the grass in patches of yellow and purple and white. The whole town came, which in practical terms meant the church was full, and the overflow stood outside in the good spring air and did not seem to mind. Clara Whitmore stood up with Mabel and cried with the uninhibited happiness of a woman who has been rooting for this outcome since August. Harold Briggs stood up with John and periodically wore the expression of a man who has been right about something for a long time and is enjoying the confirmation. Ruth Ansley sat in the front pew and did not cry, which she had announced she would not do, and then absolutely cried, which she attributed afterward to the spring pollen. The Reverend was a thin man named Morris with a kind face and a voice that was surprisingly large for his frame, and he said the words that have been said over couples making this promise for centuries. And when he said them over Mabel and John, they felt, as those words should feel, particular to the two people standing in them, not borrowed from anyone else but coined fresh for this exact occasion. John said his vows looking at her face with an expression of such direct and steady love that she felt it like sunlight, and she said hers looking back at him the same way. And when he kissed her, the town outside made enough noise that the birds in the churchyard scattered into the spring sky. They moved her things to the ranch that afternoon, which was a more practical process than it had been when she had arrived in Dusty Creek 8 months prior. She had her trunk and her satchel and her hat box and the carpet bag, and she had 14 months' worth of accumulated Dusty Creek life. The copy of Middlemark with her notes in the margins, the garnet ring that had preceded the wedding band, the jar of honey that was empty now but that she had kept on her windowsill for reasons she chose not to examine too closely. John lifted the trunk from the wagon and she reached for the hat box, and he moved to take it, and she gently took it back. "I have it," she said. He looked at her. She looked at him. Something passed between them that referenced the beginning of everything without either of them saying a word about it, and his mouth curved. "You have it," he agreed. The ranch house had been expanded over the winter. The third room was finished now, and there were curtains in the windows that he had ordered from Wichita and put up himself, and on the porch there were 2 chairs that had not been there before, set side by side facing west for the evening light. She stood on the porch in her wedding dress with the spring wind in her hair and looked out at the land rolling away in every direction, the grass new and green and the sky enormous and clear, and felt it settle into her as home. This specific piece of earth, this view from this porch. This life she had not known she was choosing when she stepped off a stagecoach in a dusty town with 4 bags and no hands left to carry them. John came to stand beside her, as he had stood that first afternoon 8 months ago, not close enough to be intrusive, but in that way that makes the space between two people feel like something. "What are you thinking?" he said. "That I am very glad I came west," she said. He put his arm around her, and she leaned into him, and they stood looking at the land as the afternoon light began to shift toward gold. And Sam Pryor could be heard moving around in the barn, because Sam had the excellent quality of being entirely invisible when invisibility was called for. The first year of their marriage was the busiest and best year of Mabel's life. She kept her teaching position, which Horace Selman did not contest again, partly because the contract renewal had been signed, and partly because John Underwood had had a quiet conversation with him in October of the previous year that she only learned about the following spring, and about which John said only that it had been a straightforward conversation between two men who each understood the situation, and she let that stand. She rode Pepper John had given her the horse, which she considered the most generous single act anyone had ever performed for her, to the schoolhouse each morning and back each afternoon, a 4-mile journey each direction that she grew to love for the thinking it afforded her. The grasslands in the morning were a particular kind of quiet, and the sky did things in the first hour of daylight that deserved a better word than beautiful. John expanded the herd to 60 head by autumn and hired a second hand, a man named Declan Marsh who had come up from Texas and had 10 years of ranching behind him and an easy way with everybody that made the ranch feel less like a work operation and more like a small community. Sam and Declan got on well, which was not guaranteed and was therefore a relief. By the time the summer of 1879 was fully settled in, Mabel was pregnant with their first child, which she told John on a Tuesday evening on the west-facing porch while Declan and Sam were occupied in the barn, and the grasslands were going golden in the late light. He went very still, the way he went still when something reached him deeply, and she watched his face do a thing she had never seen it do before, open completely, every guard down, pure astonished joy. "Mabel," he said. "Yes," she said. He put his hands on her face with extraordinary care, as though she had become something precious in the last 5 seconds, which was not precisely accurate but felt true in the way that important things feel true, and he looked at her for a long moment, and then he kissed her forehead and her cheeks and finally her mouth, and she felt the joy come off him like heat from a fire. Their son was born in February of 1880, which was not the easiest timing since Kansas in February has opinions about its own importance, but Ruth came out to the ranch 3 days before the due date and stayed, and the doctor from town arrived in time despite the road conditions, and the whole enterprise was terrifying in the way that birth always is, and then, on the other side of it, more purely wonderful than Mabel had the vocabulary for. They named him Thomas, which surprised Ruth until Mabel explained that it was partly for her father, whose middle name was Thomas, and partly because a certain 14-year-old had been the first student to make her feel that she had truly done something right in Dusty Creek, and John had agreed to both reasons without needing further persuasion. Thomas Underwood was a substantial and cheerful baby who had his father's eyes and his mother's stubbornness, and from the first weeks of his life seemed deeply interested in everything around him and deeply invested in sharing his opinions about it at all hours. John held him with the same careful capability with which he did everything else, and Mabel watched her husband with their son and felt something she was not sure there was a name for, something beyond love and beyond happiness, closer to the word rightness than anything else. Thomas Reeves, the original Thomas Reeves, now 15 and regularly the top of his class, came out to the ranch with the other students when Mabel brought them for a spring afternoon activity of learning about the practical realities of ranching, which she had sold to the school committee as agricultural education. Thomas held the baby with an expression of grave responsibility, and the baby regarded him with calm interest, and Declan Marsh told them all more about cattle than they would ever need to know, and seemed very pleased to do it. Mabel went back to teaching in April, 2 months after the birth, with Thomas Jr. in a basket in the corner of the schoolroom on days that Ruth or Clara could not be at the ranch to watch him. The children adored the baby with a unanimity that was useful for classroom management. Thomas stayed quiet only if the students stayed quiet and worked well, and they did, with an enthusiasm for silence and productivity that they had not previously demonstrated. The years in Dusty Creek moved with the quality that good years have, not quickly, not without difficulty, but with a forward direction and a sense of accumulation that feels, when you look back on it, like grace. In the summer of 1881 they had a second child, another boy, whom they named Henry for John's father, and Henry was quieter than Thomas from the beginning, a thoughtful, precise child who watched everything before he participated in it, very like his own father, which gave Mabel a particular private pleasure. She would watch Henry observe a thing from the edge of it for a long time and then reach out and engage with it with complete confidence, and she would think, yes, that is exactly right. The ranch had grown substantially by then, with 140 head of cattle, 3 hired hands including Sam and Declan, and a newer man named Will Buckley, and a second barn that Sam had helped frame up in the autumn of 1880. John had fenced the eastern pasture and put in a proper water channel from the creek that ran through the back of the property, and the house had been extended again, a proper kitchen addition, and a sleeping room for the boys, and a room that Mabel used for reading and letter writing and preparing lessons that she called her study in a way that sometimes made John smile. She had a copy of every letter her students had sent her from across the territory and beyond. Thomas Reeves had gone east to a college in Missouri on a scholarship she had fought the school committee fiercely to help him obtain, and he wrote her twice a year with letters that were extraordinarily well written and full of ideas, which she found more gratifying than any professional recognition she could have received. Aaron Reeves' little Aaron, who had been 8 and made of mischief, was 14 now and had become, with great surprise to everyone including himself, an excellent mathematician. In 1882, Mabel was 32 years old and John was 36, and they had been in Dusty Creek for 4 years, and she could not clearly reconstruct what her life had been before it, not because she had forgotten, but because this had become so fully itself that the other life felt like something she had read rather than lived. She stood on the west porch one September evening, the same porch, the 2 chairs still there, joined now by a third chair that had appeared without comment when Thomas had gotten large enough to sit in one, watching the sunset do its Kansas thing. And John came out and sat beside her, and Thomas and Henry were somewhere behind them in the house making the particular kind of sustained noise that indicated they were not in immediate danger, but were engaged in something that would probably require supervision within 10 minutes. "What are you thinking?" she said, because she liked to ask him and she liked his answers. "About the east pasture fence," he said. "Will said there is a section that needs replacing before winter." "That is very practical," she said. "I was also thinking," he said, "that this is an extremely good life." She looked at him in the fading light. The years had settled on him the way good years do. He was a little weathered and a little more sure of himself and completely unchanged in the ways that mattered, and she loved him with the particular depth of love that only comes from long knowledge, from having seen someone in every season and in every state and having found them consistently, thoroughly themselves. "Yes," she said, "it is. I did not think I would have this," he said. He was looking at the sunset and his voice was quiet and level. "When I came out here I was not," he paused, and she let him find the words because he always found them eventually. "I was not expecting any of this. The land, yes, I knew I could build something on the land, but not this. The rest of it," she said. "You," he said, "the boys, the whole thing." He shook his head slightly. "I drove past the stage stop in town a few weeks ago and I thought about the first time I saw you, with everything on the ground in the dust." He glanced at her, the old near amusement fully present. "You looked like you were about to fight the road personally." "I was considering it," she said. "I knew the minute I picked up those bags," he said. She turned to look at him. "Knew what?" "That I was in trouble," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "How did you know that quickly?" "I picked up the bags," he said, "and you looked at me and did not say thank you immediately, which most people would. You just looked at me first like you were assessing." "I was," she said. "I know," he said, "and I thought that is someone who looks at things clearly." He was quiet for a moment. "I was in trouble immediately after that." She laughed. The sunset was doing extraordinary things to the sky above the grasslands. Behind them, the noise in the house escalated in a way that indicated the 10 minutes had elapsed. "For what it is worth," she said, "I was lost the same moment." He looked at her. "You hid it well." "I had practice," she said. "I'm a schoolteacher. I hide things well when necessary." He reached out and took her hand, the same way he had in the November garden when he told her he loved her, both hands around hers, with that same gravity that made the gesture feel like a statement. "Thank you," he said, "for coming west." "Thank you for picking up my bags," she said. Inside the house, something fell over with a crash, and both of them stood up without releasing hands, and John opened the door, and Thomas was standing in the middle of the kitchen looking at a broken pitcher on the floor with the expression of a person who is doing the calculations on an apology. "It slipped," Thomas said. Said John. "I can fix it," Thomas said. "You cannot fix a broken pitcher," John said, "but you can sweep it up." "Yes, sir," Thomas said, and went for the broom with the efficiency of a boy who recognizes that efficiency is his best asset in this moment. Henry appeared from behind a chair where he had apparently been watching the whole pitcher incident with the analytical attention of a scientist observing an experiment. He regarded the swept-up pieces and then looked at his parents and said with perfect seriousness, "That was Thomas's fault." "Thank you, Henry," Thomas said bitterly. "You are welcome," Henry said. Mabel looked at John and John looked at Mabel, and the laughter that passed between them was the deep kind that comes from shared life, from years of small moments that together make something larger than any single one of them could suggest. She thought of the letter she had written to Clara in the autumn of 1878 before anything had properly happened, in which she had said, "I think I may have met someone remarkable. I am not certain yet. I am afraid to be certain yet, but I think so." And Clara had written back, "When you are afraid to be certain, that is generally when you should be most certain." Clara, as it turned out, had been entirely right. By the time the summer of 1883 arrived, Dusty Creek had grown considerably from the raw-edged town Mabel had stepped off the stagecoach into 5 years before. There was a second dry goods store now, and a proper hotel, and a telegraph office, and the school had been expanded to 2 rooms with a second teacher hired to handle the younger grades, a young woman from Indiana named Grace Fuller, who reminded Mabel powerfully of herself at 23, and whom she took an immediate interest in mentoring. Thomas Reeves had graduated from his Missouri college and come back to Dusty Creek for a summer before taking a teaching position in Abilene, and he sat in Mabel's study for an afternoon, and they talked about education with the equality of 2 colleagues rather than a student and teacher, which was one of the finest conversations she could remember having. "You changed things for me," Thomas said, plainly and without sentimentality, in the direct way he had developed as a man. "In ways I could not have articulated then, the Friday reading, the way you never made me feel small." He paused. "I wanted to tell you that. You were always capable of everything you did," Mabel said. "I just kept the door open." "A good teacher is a door," he agreed. She thought about her father when he said that, and she thought the stone in her chest that had rearranged itself years ago into something warm dissolved finally and completely into just plain sunlight. John was in the barn when Thomas Reeves left, working on the harness with Sam, and when Mabel came out and told him what Thomas had said, he listened with the complete attention he gave to things that mattered, and then he nodded once and said, "Your father would be proud." She looked at the grasslands and the September sky and thought, yes, he would. Their third child came in the late spring of 1884, and this time it was a daughter, which neither of them had expected to want quite so much until she arrived. They named her Clara, because Clara Whitmore had written to Mabel faithfully every month for 6 years, and because she had handed Mabel the letter about Dusty Creek and said there is a school there, and a woman could start fresh. which was the finest thing anyone had ever done for her, except the man who had picked up her bags on a Tuesday afternoon in June of 1878. Clara Underwood arrived in the world with red hair that nobody could account for genetically, and opinions she expressed at considerable volume from the first minutes, and Henry regarded her with the analytical attention he gave all new things, and declared, after 3 days, that he thought she was satisfactory. Thomas declared she was the best thing that had ever happened and immediately appointed himself her primary protector, a role he took seriously for the rest of his life. John held his daughter with the same extraordinary care he had given every baby, every fragile or important thing, his hands perfectly steady and his face open in that way she loved best, and he looked at Mabel over the baby's red head with an expression that was too full for words and did not try to be words. "Hello, Clara," he said softly to the baby, and the baby, against all logic, quieted. "She knows her name already," Thomas said from the doorway where he and Henry were watching with great seriousness. "All right," Mabel said to them both. "You have seen her, now let her sleep." "Can we come back tomorrow?" Henry said. "Yes," John said, "first thing." Ruth Ansley came to see the baby the following week, and held her with the practiced ease of a woman who has been a center of community life for many years, and said that she was perfect, and then said that she had known from the moment John Underwood walked Mabel to the boarding-house door that this was exactly how things would go, and she said it with a satisfaction that was entirely Ruth and entirely right. "You knew before I did," Mabel said. "I knew before you admitted it," Ruth corrected. "You knew." Mabel thought about the porch of the stagecoach stop and the bags in the dirt and the unhurried dark eyes and the silence that asked nothing. "Yes," she said, "I did." In the autumn of 1885, John Underwood stood in the yard of his ranch on a Saturday morning and looked at what 7 years of work had become, and what he saw was this: 180 head of cattle on the best grass in the county, a house with 5 rooms and a proper stone chimney and curtains in every window, a barn that was tighter than any structure in the county, 3 hired hands he trusted completely, 2 boys who could already ride and work alongside him without complaint, a red-headed baby daughter who was now 18 months old and had taken to walking at a spectacular pace directly toward any danger available, and his wife coming across the yard from the house with 2 cups of coffee, her dark hair loose around her shoulders in the morning, Pepper following her at a respectful distance, because the horse had decided years ago that wherever Mabel went was where things were happening. He took his coffee and she stood beside him, and they looked at the grasslands and the morning sky. "What are you thinking?" she said. "That I would like to put another room on the south side," he said. "For when Thomas is older and needs his own space." He and Henry are starting to argue about the lamp. "They argue about everything," she said. "They argue the way people argue when they love each other," he said. "It is mostly entertainment." She sipped her coffee. The morning was fresh and the sky was doing its October thing, that deep particular blue. Clara had appeared in the doorway of the house and was regarding the yard with the strategic interest of a child who is identifying her next adventure. "John," Mabel said. "Yes," he said. "Do you remember when you picked up my bags?" He looked at her. A slow smile, the full one that she had not been warned about and never got used to. "Yes. I have been thinking about that lately," she said. "About what it meant." "What it was." "What was it?" he said. She looked at the land and the sky and the morning and then at him. "It was the most precisely you thing I have ever seen anyone do," she said. "It was you completely in one motion. You saw something that needed doing and you did it, and you did not make it about yourself." She shook her head slightly. "I did not know in that moment what I was recognizing. I did not have the language for it yet, but I was recognizing you." He was quiet for a moment. "And now you have the language." "Yes," she said. He put his arm around her, and they stood in the yard with the coffee and the morning and the cattle moving in the far pasture, and Clara galloping across the yard toward the fence at a pace that was going to require intervention within 30 seconds. "I recognized you too," he said quietly. "In that first moment. When you looked at me before you thanked me." He smiled again. "I thought That is someone who sees things clearly. I have never stopped thinking that. Clara reached the fence and began attempting to climb it. Henry appeared from nowhere, as Henry always did, and stood beside his sister with the expression of a scientist conducting an experiment on whether intervention was yet required. "Henry," John called, "help your sister down from that fence." "She got up herself," Henry said, with impeccable logic. "Henry," Mabel said, in the voice she had perfected over 7 years of school teaching. Henry helped his sister down from the fence. Thomas burst out of the house at a run for no apparent reason, saw his sister safe, saw his parents watching, and converted the run smoothly into a purposeful walk, which convinced no one. "Good morning," he said, with the dignity of a 9-year-old who has not just been running for no reason. "Good morning," John said, with the gravity of a man who does not wish to undermine his son's dignity. Mabel looked at all of it, the yard, the children, the man beside her, the land behind them all, the prairie morning with its impossible sky, and she thought of the letter she had sent her father's sister Incent Louis a year after her arrival in Dusty Creek, in which she had written, "I have found something I did not know I was looking for. I came west to start fresh, and what I found instead was the place where I was already supposed to be." That was true then, and it was more true now, and it would be more true still the next morning and every morning after that. The school in Dusty Creek kept growing, as the town kept growing, and by 1886 there were 3 rooms and 2 teachers under Mabel, and the school committee had formalized her role as head teacher in a way that made her position not merely a job but a designation. A recognition that was not required to be re-earned each year by a woman's willingness to fight for it. Horace Selman had sold his cattle operation in 1883 and moved to Colorado, which everyone in Dusty Creek agreed was a satisfactory outcome for everyone involved, most especially Colorado. The letter from Thomas Reeves arrived from Abilene in the summer of 1886, with news that he had married a woman named Helen who was a bookkeeper, and who, he wrote, reminded him somewhat of Mabel in the particular quality of her certainty, which he meant as the highest possible compliment, and Mabel received as such. She wrote back a letter full of genuine happiness, and John wrote a separate shorter letter congratulating him on his sound judgment, which Thomas framed and kept on his wall. Henry Underwood turned 6 in 1886, and began attending his mother's school, which created a dynamic that both of them navigated with great seriousness. Henry applied himself to learning with the same methodical precision he brought to everything, and he had his father's particular quality of noticing what needed doing and simply doing it. He helped the younger students without being asked. He corrected his own work before handing it in independently. He was, Mabel told John one evening, the most naturally conscientious student she had ever encountered. John looked at his coffee. "He gets that from you," he said. "He gets it from you," she said. "I noticed what needed doing and I did it. You were already doing it before anyone had the chance to notice." He considered this. "That may be the nicest thing you have ever said to me." "I say nice things to you regularly," she said. "You do," he agreed. "But that one was very good." She threw a dish towel at him, which he caught. In 1887, Mabel turned 33 and John turned 37, and their daughter Clara was 3 years old and had learned to say her own name very clearly and applied it liberally to everything she considered her property, which was most things. The Kansas autumn was spectacular that year, the grasslands turning every shade of gold and amber, and the sky going that particular deep autumn blue, and they rode out together on a Sunday. Just the 2 of them, both children left with Sam and Declan, who had taken to the role of ranch uncles with great enthusiasm, and rode across the prairie in a way she remembered from the early months of their courting, when the land had been a gift he was showing her for the first time. It was different now. It was theirs in a way that had grown through years of daily belonging. They stopped on a low rise that gave them a view across the grasslands in every direction, and the horses stood quietly, and the sky was enormous, and John Underwood looked at his wife on horseback in the autumn afternoon and said, without preamble, I want you to know that there is not one part of this life that I would change." She looked at him thoroughly, in the way she had looked at him from the very first day, taking in the full weather of his face. "Not one," she said. "Not one," he said. She thought of all the things that had been hard. The cold winters and the stretches when the cattle market was difficult, and the year that 3 of their best head were lost to a fever, and the argument over Horace Selman, and the long months when she had been tired from teaching and mothering, and the daily work of building something that was worth having. She thought of all of it. "Not one," she agreed. They rode home with the afternoon going golden around them and the horses moving in easy companionship, and she thought, "This is the one. This is the life. This is the thing you do not know you are building when you are building it. And then one day you look at it from the outside, and it is complete, and it is yours, and it is better than anything you planned." The house was loud when they came in. Clara had developed strong opinions about dinner, and was expressing them at length. Thomas was arguing with Henry about something that had been apparently ongoing, and Sam had put coffee on the stove, and was reading a newspaper with the focused calm of a man who has decided to be uninvolved in domestic negotiations. John took off his coat and waded into the dinner debate with the easy assurance of a father who has been doing this for years. And Mabel stood in the doorway of her own kitchen and watched him and loved him with the full, uncomplicated weight of a love that has been tested and proven and is no longer afraid of itself. She hung her coat up and rolled up her sleeves and went to help with dinner, and John caught her eye across the kitchen and she caught his, and the whole world was in that look. Every mile of road and every Sunday and every cup of coffee and every November garden, and every bag lifted off the ground without being asked, and every dance and every argument and every dawn over the prairie, and every word ever said and left unsaid, and every good night, and every good morning, and every single morning yet to come. Later that evening, after the children were in bed and the house was quiet and Sam and Declan had gone to the bunkhouse, and the night was clear and cold and full of stars, they sat on the west porch in the 2 chairs that had been there since the beginning, the 3rd chair empty beside them where Clara would sit when she was older, and the grasslands were silver in the moonlight, and the air smelled of late autumn and wood smoke, and the particular clean cold of Kansas. And John refilled her coffee without being asked the way he always did, and she thanked him the way she always did, and he said it was nothing the way he always did. And nothing was everything. It had always been. The stars above Dusty Creek were the same stars that had been there in 1878, when a woman climbed off a stagecoach in a new town with 4 bags, and more nerve than sense, and no clear idea of what she was walking toward. They were indifferent stars, as all stars are, but they were witness to what had happened under them, and what had happened was this. A man had seen bags in the dirt and picked them up without being asked, and a woman had looked at him before she thanked him, and 2 people had recognized each other in a single unhurried moment, and everything else had followed from that. The ranch, the children, the school, the life, the years, the love that had grown from the particular seed of a man who moved through the world asking nothing in return and gave everything without making a statement of it. Mabel Gentry had come to Dusty Creek to start fresh, and what she had found was that starting fresh did not mean leaving the past behind, but rather carrying it forward into something new, the way a good foundation carries the weight of everything built upon it. She was 33 years old, and she was exactly where she was supposed to be, and the man beside her in the other chair was the reason, and the children asleep in the house were the proof, and the land rolling away under the moon was the setting for all of it, and she had none of it and all of it because of a Tuesday afternoon and 4 bags in the dirt, and a man who had looked at what needed doing and done it. "John," she said. "Yes," he said. "Thank you for carrying my bags." He turned and looked at her, and she looked back, and the amusement was there, that full, warm thing, and behind it all the years and all the love and all the particular history of 2 specific people in one specific place. "Any time," he said. She laughed and he laughed, and the stars held their positions above the Kansas prairie, and the grasslands went on in every direction into the good dark. And the house was warm behind them, and tomorrow would come and bring its own work and its own grace, and they would meet it together, as they had met every day since a stagecoach left her standing in the dust of a town she had never been to before, and a man she had never met saw what needed doing. He always did.